Hello and welcome everybody to today's event, Wrangling Social Media in Big Sky Country, how Helena is corralling the digital records Stampede. This is Morgan Wright. I'm a senior fellow for government technology. I'm also a national media analyst on issues of cybercrime and cyber terrorism, and I am excited to serve as the moderator for today's event, and I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. I know you're in for a great session for the next 60 minutes, so let's strap in and get started. But before we begin, just a couple of brief housekeeping notes. A recording of this presentation will be emailed to everybody within 48 hours. So you can use this recording for your reference, or feel free to pass it along to each of your colleagues who couldn't make today's webinar. Now, it's also designed to be interactive, folks, so as you participate, hit us up on the Q&A. Give us your questions. It's a box on the bottom left of the presentation panel. Send in your questions as they come in throughout the presentation. We'll either get to them and answer you directly, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of our session for the Q&A. So at the close of the webinar today. So if you'd like to download a PDF of the slides for this presentation, you can do so by clicking on the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console. Also, during today's webinar, you'll be able to connect with all of your friends via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I've already sent out the first tweet on Twitter. Use the hashtag GTLive to connect with everybody. And at this time, we also recommend that you disable your pop-up blockers. And if you're experiencing any media player issues or have any other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help button at the bottom of the console. So joining me today to discuss this very timely topic, and I have to tell you, we've had a lot of fun putting this together, both Sarah and Anil. A lot of fun. We've had some great conversations leading up to this, and I know you guys are going to enjoy this. So Sarah is the Public Affairs Specialist and the Assistant to the City Manager for the City of Helena, and Anil Chawla is the founder and CEO of Archive Social. But before we get started, I get to do just a little bit of state of the state, kind of give you a brief overview of what's setting this topic up. So we kind of, play on words. It's Big Sky Country, not their official motto, but one that everybody knows Montana by. So let's talk a little bit about the state of the state and what's going on. And as we do that, make sure that you check us out on Government Technology. We're an award-winning publication, set of publications, and we also are a great collection with the Center for Digital Government of research and advisory information around technology, best practices in state and local government. So make sure you check out all these available free resources for you folks out there in the state and local space. So let's get started today, because ultimately what this is about, it's about ones and zeros. Social media, technology, it all reduces itself down to ones and zeros, but these ones and zeros would be my name. So as we get started with this, just remember, ask your questions, but at the end of the day, as we talk about this, these ones and zeros have to be guided by policies, have to be guided by good best practices, and that's what we're going to cover today. So let's talk about this now. Let's talk about Welcome to Helena. So a few things I found out about Helena. First of all, you've got a serious gang problem in Helena. Yes, we are talking about those folks. I didn't realize that a herd of moose were called gangs until I did some research. And as I did this, I found out you have a serious gang problem. They do roam the streets, but we wish you the best on that. The other thing, too, is I love this, too, the tour train. Most of you folks have seen that, but if you're not from Helena, a lot of great history. It's just so beautiful, so scenic, but it's being invaded. What's it being invaded by? It's being invaded by social media. So the Twitter birds all over the place. Well, how do we wrangle that? Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because there's three things we want to talk about today. We want to give you a state of the social media recon, what I've seen out there, what Anil and both Sarah are going to talk about. Let's talk about bits, bytes, and barristers, some of the legal issues, tee up a couple of those that are involved with social media, and then can this beast be tamed? We think it can, but we'll get your opinion on it too with a couple of poll questions. So, social media recon, let's take a look. What's really driving this? Well, folks, if you've ever done social media, and some of you, it's like herding cats, right? One of the famous commercials out there. It's pretty tough to do it. You've got all these different platforms. It seems sometimes like it is mission impossible. Where do we start? What do we do? We want to start a Facebook page. We want Twitter. How do we write policies? What do we do? So it seems like mission impossible. You know who makes this difficult? Folks like Apple, folks like Samsung. Because Apple, when they put out their iPhone, 75 million phones in one quarter. Think about all of those folks. Think about the networks that's providing this connectivity. Now these folks are using mobile technology to want and demand and access more government resources. They want you to be more responsive. Social media has been one of the unique ways to improve that interaction between the constituent and their government. But when we go to Bits, Bytes, and Barristers, what happens there? Well, as always, anytime something new comes along, there are some issues with it. So here's some of the headlines from the New York Times. Even if it enrages your boss, social net speech is protected. However, on the other hand, the National Labor Relations Board had far less sympathy for a reporter. This was in the Arizona Daily Star when she posted a news snippet basically saying, what's the matter, folks? No overnight homicides? You're slacking, Tucson. They said that that wasn't exactly protected. But then we get into this one. This is kind of a unique one, too, and I remember when this happens, I've got some friends who are in law enforcement up in Peoria. A guy with a fake Twitter account gets raided by the real police over his fake Twitter account. So that obviously caused some legal issues. But here's ones I think this is kind of, how do we know a problem was coming? When an attorney writes a post back in 2012, August of 2012, says how deleting a Facebook post may violate free speech and lead to a lawsuit. And then what happened? This happened just about a year later. Actually, November 2014. A sheriff removed a Facebook page after a lawsuit over deleted comments. They deleted posts on their Facebook page, resulted in a lawsuit, and they ended up having to remove their Facebook page. So we're going to give you some tools to understand that. So the question is, can the beast be tamed? Well, we think it can, but who says no? Grumpy Cat says no. We think they're wrong, and I'm pretty sure Sarah and Anil are going to show you actually how you can tame this beast. And folks, my random password hack of the day and a cybersecurity tip for you is that we actually did hack Forrest Gump's account, and what was it? Who can guess the password? You're right, it was 1Forrest1. I know, childish humor, but we had to get you guys engaged in this seminar before we get talking. So the best part now is now for our show. So, but before I get to the first poll question, or actually let me get to the first poll question, then I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So let's go to the poll question. This first one is, what is your opinion on social media as a public record? Number one, it's definitely a public record. Number two, it might be a record, but our activity isn't worth retaining. Number three, you feel strongly that it is not a public record. Or number four, the always available, I don't know. So think about that for a second, and as the results are coming in, let me introduce our first speaker, Sarah Elkins. Now, Sarah is the public affairs specialist for the city of Helena, Montana. She moved to Montana's capital nearly 16 years ago from Washington, D.C., where she was a PeopleSoft consultant with several federal agencies, including the NSA, Federal Reserve, and the U.S. Department of Education. Now, after a few years at two state agencies revealed far too much about the workings of state government, Sarah accepted her current position as Helena's first public affairs specialist back in January of 2013. She's eager to share the story of Helena's services and dedicated staff and to improve communication for its wonderful community. Now, her expertise in training and facilitating in the customer service environment comes from myriad service-related experiences, many of those years in the restaurant industry to collecting data for financial reporting to the federal government. She's a skilled teacher, and Sarah also offers customer service trainings and workshops and is regularly asked to speak about subjects such as customer service, diversity, and about being Jewish in Montana. Plus, I hear she plays in a wicked cool band. So let's find out what the results were. 60% of you said, hey, it's definitely a public record by law. About 23% of you said it might be a record, but it's not worth retaining. Nobody said it wasn't a public record, and about 20% of you said, I don't know. So I think that's really good to get started. So, Sarah, let's do this. Let's turn the floor over to you, and let's walk everybody through how Helena is corralling this big stampede of social media that's going on. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Morgan, and welcome to this webinar. I'm pretty excited to be here today. You know, it's interesting because when I was interviewing for this position, I was so excited. I was telling my boss and the people in the room that our city doesn't do a good enough job telling our story because we offer such great services. So when I started, I was pretty excited to get started. And this was my first day, except that I wasn't threatened. But it took me nearly 4 months to get access to social media on my computer at work. I couldn't even view Facebook, much less participate in it. And I had to convince my boss, I had to convince the leadership in this organization that Facebook and other social media strategies were great ways to meet our community where they are. There were two fears I had to address with this group. I had to address the resources question. The concern was that people would be spending far too many hours surfing Facebook and not doing their real job. We don't have time, we don't have money to engage in this method of communication. The other fear that I had to address was the concern about control. They were concerned that they would lose control of their message and their reputation. So if it's such a scary thing, why should we do it? Well, there's a reality here. Your community is there. If you want to reach them, this is just one more way to do it. Your constituents will ask, why aren't you doing everything within your power to share that information and content with the taxpayers? They expect you to be where they are. So we sort of have to. We're going that direction. This is an example of one of the things that I've posted on Facebook and other social media platforms. So the way I address the resources question, I know we can't do more with less, but we can do better by shifting what we have. When I worked for the state library, that was one of our mantras, because if you're looking at the library industry right now, their book budgets are getting dropped, and their budgets for sustainable electronic subscriptions are going up. So it's not that they're giving up on the paper books. They're not giving up on hard copy books because there's still a lot of people that read them. However, they're spending a lot less money in that area, and that's what we have to do with social media. The reality is that for smaller projects and announcements, rather than spending the time crafting a great media release, you should be crafting and composing posts and tweets. And honestly, the media will follow you if you're posting relevant content. So how did I manage to get onto social media here in our little town? First of all, I had to get access. I had to use a golf analogy. My boss is a big golfer, and I had to explain to him that he gave me this great job of sharing our story, but he wasn't giving me the tools to share our story, and it's sort of like inviting me for 18 holes of golf and giving me a putter. And he understood that and almost immediately gave me access to what I needed. I found advocates within the organization, the police chief. The word innovative or innovate is in their mission statement. So I convinced him that Facebook is no longer innovative. We'll be barely catching up by getting active on Facebook. And our city attorney was actually pretty excited about the possibility of putting things out there and being a little more transparent. So I started by drafting a social media policy, and I had a separate strategy document that is a little more flexible than the policy itself so that it can be adjusted more easily. And then I made a plan for archiving our posts. Now, the understanding was that we weren't going to be incredibly busy, so really what I worked on was I figured I would do screenshots, and I have a screen capture software on my machine, and every month I would go back and do screenshots, and it worked out pretty well. Here's another example of one of the things that I posted. You know, our city is very active. There are lots of people that speak up, and this is an important issue, is potholes. So the first thing that I like to share is that there are some pitfalls that you want to avoid. First of all, before you get into any kind of social media for your organization, you want to create a policy. And we have two policies related to social media here in the city of Helena. We have one that's about personal use through the IT department. The idea that you really shouldn't be accessing social media from your work computer. Very often, you know, we really don't want our resources to be wasted on people surfing Facebook all day. At the same time, we had to have a social media policy for the departments to use. And within that policy, or as an attachment to it, we wanted to make sure that there was a clear strategy. Who's going to post? What will they post? Where? Which social media platforms are we going to use? Why do we want to post? What action do we want our community to take if we're going to post? All those questions need to be addressed, at least in the beginning, as a template. The other thing that we had to do is make sure that we were covered in terms of what our Facebook page said. So as you can see this example, we wanted to make sure that people weren't going to report a crime or an emergency here on the City of Helena local government Facebook page. And our folks over at the police department really appreciated having something like this on our page. And also the idea that we didn't want to delete any posts for the reasons that Morgan went over at the very beginning. We didn't want to risk that. However, we do every once in a while have to hide a post because it's not appropriate or it doesn't really fit. But that's, again, in here, Obviously, this isn't going to protect you in a lawsuit completely, but at least we're making the effort to let our constituents know that this is not a good place to engage in negative conversations. We'd rather them do that in person where we have a policeman handy to deal with it. We also wanted to make sure that people understood the limits of use of this social media. And if anyone read that article about the one stupid tweet can ruin your life, and it's a story about a woman named Justine Seiko who did one little tweet, and she got fired from her job. She got into trouble with her family. People really need to understand that this is public and that there's a really difficult line between what you're sharing as a person versus what you're sharing professionally. I think you're in denial if you think you can keep your personal and professional social personality separated. I just don't think that's possible. So the next thing you have to do is make plans for that archiving. Again, we were surprised at the level of engagement that we got almost immediately. Within a few months, one of our posts would reach almost 2,000 people in our town of 28,000. Our posts would get a lot of likes. The Helena Police Department was almost immediately the most popular Facebook site in the city. There's one that's more popular, the Helena Classifieds, but that's a whole different story. We were sharing all kinds of information and getting all kinds of feedback. There were great ways to reach our community. This was one of the things that got a lot of views, as you can imagine. So when we went to decide to archive our social media, we had to get a list of specifications together and figure out really the budget impact of archiving our social media. And one of the things that I realized very quickly when I was going through the demonstrations of different products out there was that some products actually will archive the social media by the person that owns the page. Now, most of you probably know that in Facebook, you have to have a personal page in order to create a group page. And there are people who create a separate persona with a different email address in order to create a group page. There's a downside to that. If Facebook catches you with multiple personal pages, sometimes they'll shut down all pages related to you and your email addresses. So you really want to make sure that whoever's archiving your social media, that they're archiving it by the department page and not the personal page. And the reason I put this picture on is because this was on my Facebook page, my personal page. Do I really want this to be archived along with the City of Helena local government pages? Probably not. So here's how I listed the specifications. I wanted to make sure it was going to be simple. Our IT department is already stretched really thin. I really didn't want to rely on them to support and maintain whatever system we decided to use. I wanted to make sure that the right people had access to the tool, especially our city attorney. I wanted it to be easy for the public to access. One of my colleagues asked if we have this available on our homepage yet, and I said no, but that is a big issue. Can you have your constituents easily access this service if they want to have a search of any posts on your page related to a certain topic? They should have access to that, and that's customer service. We also wanted a simple but robust search available, and that's where my attorney came in. So that was great for us. Here is why we are doing this. Our constituents deserve to hear from us. They need to be involved in the day-to-day communications in our city. And what better way than for us to post something and have them respond to it? Because in reality, communication is customer service. And that's been my biggest push from the beginning, from the 2 years ago when I started this job, is to improve customer service. We already offer great customer service. What we needed to improve on was to share how great we were with our community and have them tell us how we could do even better. So that's my presentation so far. I'm obviously open to any questions that you might have at the end, and I'm going to turn this right back over to Morgan.
Well, hey, Sarah, fantastic job. Love the way that you guys, I tell you, being a cop for 18 years, there are so many people who are resident. I think your strategy of going and getting executive sponsorship from other areas, that third-party, credibility to lend to it was a brilliant strategy. And if you folks are on the call or on the webinar, make sure you keep sending us your questions. I think that was a great approach to it. And guys, sometimes it's not just about saying I want to do it. You've got to go out and find your internal champions. So great job, Sarah. So now let's go to our next speaker. So you bet. Hey, let me introduce Anil Chawla to you. Now, it's always a pleasure when you get the founder and CEO of the company on the call because you know they can answer your questions. So make sure you hit that Q&A, get us your questions in. Anil is the founder and CEO of Archive Social. As I said, it's a civic tech company that specializes in archiving social media for public records requirements. Now, Archive Social partnered with the state of North Carolina in 2010 to launch the world's first open interactive archives of social media. Since then, Archive Social has enabled hundreds of government entities such as Helena, Missoula, and the U.S. National Archives, folks. That is the U.S. National Archives responsible for archiving all of government to ensure long-term transparency for government social media communications. The company was selected for the prestigious Code for America. I like saying not prestigious, but prestigious because it sounds so much formal and British. Code for America Accelerator in 2013. And this is the one I like, too, because I know a lot of folks at Gartner. They were recognized as a 2014 Cool Vendor by Gartner in government. So I think that was a great, and it's a great lead-in for this next poll, shows you the depth and breadth of what Archive Social does. So let's talk about this. How is your agency currently retaining records of social media? Number one, we're not retaining our own records and rely on the networks, which that's Facebook, Twitter, right? We take manual captures, what Sarah was talking about, screenshots, copy and paste. We use a personal backup tool like Backupify, Social Safe, etc. We use an automated solution for archiving, and then the one Anil always loves to see, are you already a happy Archive Social customer? So let's go to the results, as they say. Well, two-thirds of you, it's very clear, are not retaining your own records and rely on the networks. And then about a third of you say you take manual capture. So, Anil, I think this has laid the groundwork for a very interesting presentation by you. So I think you're going to hit this out of the park. So let's turn it over to Anil. Anil, the floor is yours.
Morgan, I absolutely agree, and thank you so much for the prestigious introduction there. I also want to thank everyone that's tuned in today, taking some time out of your busy Thursday to learn about an important topic. And most importantly, I want to thank Sarah for her participation in this presentation. What Sarah covered there is a conversation that we just see day in and day out as we talk to agencies across the country in terms of getting social media up and running, being able to allocate resources effectively, and ultimately understanding the purpose behind social media, where I fully agree with Sarah that communications is customer service, and perhaps social media provides a mechanism that never existed before to provide that customer service in an interactive, two-way fashion that's possible despite where you're physically located in terms of being in a region with your citizens. So thank you so much again, Sarah, for that advice. I think it'll be really helpful. Now, in terms of what I'd like to cover today, we've had two polls presented during this presentation where we appreciate all of you putting your feedback in to know where you are, where you stand. I thought it was quite striking that about 50% of you felt that you weren't quite sure that social media was a record worth keeping, or you weren't quite sure if social media was a record at all. So that's something that I really want to tackle here in my presentation. And then seeing 30% of you are doing screenshots like Helena started out doing, that's also really interesting. So what I want to do, I want to start by talking about the concept of social media as a public record. And I don't want to just keep this at an academic level. I want to dive into some real-life examples and show you some real-life legal incidents so you can understand how the case law is forming around this issue. Once we establish the importance of record keeping and what constitutes records, I then do want to talk about some solutions. Again, I saw a third of you are doing screenshots today, so kudos to you for doing something to keep records. The other two-thirds of you, I think we'll be able to provide you some really interesting options here. I've got 4 different approaches that you can consider for your agency. And time permitting, I do want to share an archive, a demonstration of an automated archive, so you can see how Helena is tackling this issue today now that they've moved on from screenshotting. And of course, we're here to answer your questions, so please do use that Q&A window. Now, to kick things off in terms of the public records issue, the 30% of you that said you're not quite sure whether social media is a public record or not, this is for you. Essentially, the public records law in Montana was written decades ago, like all the public records laws in this country, without any knowledge of the kind of technology that we would use today. But the laws are written in a very forward-thinking fashion. In fact, there's a phrase in your law that goes by regardless of physical form. This is a phrase that we see in virtually every public records law in the country. And it's a broad phrase intentionally, because what it's trying to say is that it doesn't really matter what format something is communicated in. It's what is communicated that matters. It's the content that matters. So to give you a very clear example, if you were to receive a crime tip, we all know that's a pretty important record. It doesn't matter if you receive a crime tip on a piece of paper, in an email, or in a Twitter direct message. A crime tip is a crime tip, and it's worth keeping. And that's exactly what the law is intended to say when it was written decades ago. Now, fortunately, in Montana, this issue is an issue that has been explored, and folks in Montana have recognized that social media is, in fact, record. In fact, the Montana Operations Manual, or I take it you call it MOM, had a document published in 2013 that explicitly says that social media constitutes public record and should be treated as such. And so this is something that many Montana jurisdictions and agencies have evaluated and understood. Of course, the question is now whether what you're doing on social media is creating public records, and then if so, how do you keep it? So let's talk about what actually constitutes a record. What could you possibly do on social media that's worth keeping outside of just having it up there on Facebook and Twitter? Well, to start with, some really clear examples. Looks like we have a little bit of a snafu here with the slide deck with some image loading, but essentially public safety and emergency response is I think this is clear to most of our audience that when disaster strikes, when there's a large-scale crime, getting information out on social media is incredibly important. In fact, it provides perhaps the most efficient way to get information out and protect your citizens. We've seen this time and time again with natural disasters and various crimes that affected our country. One of the images that you don't see here is from the Boston Marathon bombings, but I think we're all familiar with that unfortunate tragedy. The silver lining on that tragedy was the emergency response that happened in general, but also over social media, and the use of the Boston PD's Twitter account. It was just amazing. In fact, a little trivia fact is that when the Boston PD finally caught the terror suspect, the very first announcement of catching the suspect was a tweet. It wasn't something on their website. It wasn't an official release. It wasn't a tip to a journalist. It was a tweet. That was where that information was documented. In fact, throughout the suspect hunt, there were dozens and dozens of tweets coming out from Boston PD to inform the public and keep the police officers safe. And all those records were only on Twitter at that time. Really important records, and no matter where you are, no matter how big or crime or big or small the crime or emergency might be, I think it's pretty clear to see that during emergencies you want to be able to use social media, and you are going to create records that are worth keeping. And then to tie back to Sarah's presentation, communications and the use of social media is customer service. At least my view, and I think a lot of folks share this view, is that government fundamentally exists to serve the citizens. So as a government agency, when you're on social media, day in, day out, you are providing customer service. And here's a really interesting example, I think, to highlight the different ways in which customer service can manifest itself. This is from the Texas DOT. Essentially, a woman was trying to call the Texas DOT, couldn't get through, so she started tweeting to the Twitter account and said, hey, I can't get through your phone number. They actually responded back saying, well, our phone lines might be busy. Well, it turns out that the woman was trying to call a number that was incorrect. It was incorrectly printed on a mailing. And so she discovered this, and she was able to inform Texas DOT of this incorrect number that was printed out. Now, this is kind of an interesting example because it has nothing to do with the DOT's main mission of dealing with traffic and transportation. It's sort of a related issue of the person just trying to contact the agency. But you can see how all of this got documented on Twitter, and it was important feedback from the citizen, hopefully nothing with a legal context, but certainly something important, something that you might want to keep records of. And this is the kind of interaction that happens day in and day out on almost any government agency's social media sites, assuming there's some engagement happening there, that many folks may not immediately think of this being a public record or may not even think of the importance of this information. But it's really important because this is how you're serving the citizens, and this needs to be documented based on the nature of your laws and for your transparency initiatives. So the next question might be, well, okay, fine, maybe we are creating public records on social media, but who's asking for them, and can't they just go to Twitter and Facebook to get it? Well, here's an incident from last year, almost exactly a year ago, where a citizen was following the Twitter feeds the Seattle PD has. Basically, the Seattle PD has Twitter feeds that are supposed to auto-post police incidents, and the citizen noticed that some of the feeds were either delayed or perhaps missing information, so he started asking the Seattle PD about this. Again, he couldn't go with what's on Twitter because he thought the information was missing. So he made a tweet that said, "I want the archives of all tweets available for each of your police beats, and please consider this a public records request." So in effect, this was a public records request for social media using social media. And if you find that shocking, it is kind of eye-opening, but it's also a sign of the changing times. What the changing expectations that citizens have. If you're on social media and you're available there, why not be able to ask this question? Now, Seattle PD did direct the citizen to the official web form for submitting public records requests, but they did acknowledge this is a real request they had to fulfill. And they immediately responded back saying, please give us at least 3 weeks to respond to this request. The question is, if you were to get this request in your agency, how would you deal with it? And how can you do it in a much shorter time frame than 3 weeks? Perhaps could you do it in even 3 minutes? That's a really special example because it's directly an ask for social media content, but most agencies probably haven't received a direct request for social media content in a public information request, at least not quite yet. However, when we talk to our customers and agencies across the country, we find that these are the text that I have on the screen. This is the kind of text that you see in a public records request. Any and all documents that relate to, all reports of the incident, all notifications of the street closure, all emails and communications. Well, if you think about that, that obviously includes social media, and some of these, for example, notifications of a street closure, that's probably something that you might be posting on social media, and so it's probably something you want to include to really fulfill this request. And more and more citizens and journalists are beginning to expect truly getting all of the communications that were put out, especially if more of those communications are happening on social media than over traditional means. So again, these may be requests that you're already receiving, and so you should think about how this may cover some of the social media that you have. So we've talked about social media being a record, the kind of communications that constitute records, and the fact that it's important to get ahead of this issue because this information is already being requested. But what do we actually see in the legal landscape? So I have a couple of different case studies to cover here, both at a general level, and then I've got some really specific ones I think you'll find interesting out of our customer base. The first one that I want to cover actually comes out of email and not social media because we have a tremendous amount of case law with email, and email is a perfect analogy for social media. Almost 20 years ago, we were asking the same questions about email being a public record, and now it's pretty obvious that it is. But essentially, a citizen had to ask for an email. This is to a city in Washington, and the city was able to provide a copy of the email, but not the original. They were able to provide a forward of the email. And the citizen knew they were getting a forward and not the original, so they asked for the original with all of the original metadata. Now, if you're not familiar with metadata, that's the technical information that's embedded in the email about how it was sent, what computer servers it went across, who sent it, when it was sent, all that kind of stuff. And the city couldn't produce it. They only had a copy. And so this went to the Supreme Court in Washington. The Supreme Court ruled, yes, metadata is part of public record. And ultimately, the city had to settle the case after 7 years, paying more than $500,000 to cover plaintiff's fees and a $100,000 fine for not having the metadata. So again, having some record is good, but it may not protect your agency fully. In this case, the email copy had all of the text of the email, just not the metadata in it. And it cost the city in a big way. And how does that translate to social media? Well, we've talked about screenshots. A third of you are doing screenshots. Again, that's a great way to get started, but your screenshots, hate to be the bearer of bad news, screenshots do not meet the metadata requirement. They only have the text that you see. So a tweet, for example, this tweet has 126 characters. Underneath this tweet has more than 2,000 characters of metadata, information like user IDs, timestamps, location information. That's 2,000 characters that are missing from an approach like screenshotting. So the question is, how do you get to this level of record keeping? Another case that we've seen nationally, this is from the Honolulu PD, an unfortunate case in 2012. This actually has nothing to do with public records. In this situation, an advocacy group was expressing their opinion on the Honolulu PD page, and the PD felt like those posts were not exactly relevant to the conversations that were happening. So they removed those postings that could have been seen as controversial. And the group turned around and filed lawsuits alleging their First Amendment freedom of speech rights to express their opinion. Now, this case was never ruled upon. The city decided just to settle the case by paying $30,000 in attorney's fees. It did raise some eyebrows in terms of moderation, content moderation, and comment moderation. Now, we at Archive Social, we're not your lawyers, but we do believe you have the right to moderate content. You want to treat your pages like a limited public forum. You may want to use that language. And you want to have a very, very clear policy about when and how you will moderate, and you want to follow that policy. But the reason why I bring this up from a record-keeping standpoint is that this is a lawsuit dealing with social media, and it was dealing with content that was deleted. So when you go to court to now tell your side of the story, and you have to tell your story about content that was deleted, how do you tell your story if you don't have the records? You have to have the records. It's an important thing to do to protect your agency beyond just public records. And then a little bit closer to home, we've been on the market now for a few years. Early on, we were working with agencies that just wanted to be proactive, that knew that the storm might be coming. Again, our mission is not to any way impede you from using social media. It's the exact opposite. We don't want the legal risk and the policy challenges to impede you. We want to remove those barriers. So we worked with a lot of customers to get archiving in place early on, and now we're hearing stories. So here are 3 stories that are really close to home for us because it really speaks to the importance of being proactive and having record keeping in place. The first is from South Florida. This is a case in which the police department was honestly just trying to do their job. They learned about a company that was potentially a scam, and they learned about this from a law firm, so they trusted the information, and they put it out on their social media feeds. Unfortunately, the company did not agree with the label of being a scam, and the company came back, complained. The police department then removed their postings, and then the company then followed up with a lawsuit alleging damages to their business. In the lawsuit, the company said that they wanted all social media postings related to the scam alert, including the ones that had already been removed and deleted. Fortunately, this customer had started archiving. They saw the need to be proactive. They were able to produce it. And you can imagine that if they weren't able to respond to that first request of information as part of this lawsuit, that would put them in an even worse legal position going into the lawsuit. Across the country, a customer in California, this is kind of an interesting story for us internally because a member of our sales team was periodically checking in with his contact over there who wanted to start trying out our solution but kept having to put it off for other priorities, and finally set up a free trial, and literally 3 weeks into the free trial received a public information request from the NRA related to the city's gun buyback program. Now, this is another case of the police department just doing their job, helping implement a city program, not even going out of their way. They're just implementing a city's program. And they receive a public information request from the NRA who wants to ensure that, of course, this buyback program is being run in accordance with law. And during the free trial, they were able to produce the content, fortunately, and, of course, have continued archiving with us since then. And finally, in the Pacific Northwest, City of Spokane, Washington, this is actually a government technology case study that's been published. One of our earliest customers really wanted to be proactive on this issue, knowing that these kinds of communications could be important. But it's kind of eye-opening when you look at this situation because all the city was doing in this case was promoting a local event. Those of you using social media, I can't imagine if any of you on the phone using social media aren't promoting local events. So all they were doing was promoting a local event, but unfortunately somebody died on that event, one of those events. And the lawsuit for that death came back and asked the city to produce all the records related to the promotion of that event. And in the case study, Spokane talks about how the state of Washington has fines if you're not able to respond to records requests in time. And so they were able to produce those records right away, fortunately. So again, that eliminates the barrier. None of these agencies had to close down their social media, stop what they had to do. They faced risk. They were proactive. They were able to manage the risk the best that they could so that their cities, these agencies, are best able to continue using social media. So how do you also do the same and protect your agency? Well, I have a set of options here I want to share with you, starting from the most basic to the most sophisticated. But the number one thing I'm going to do is tell the 60% of you, or 2/3 of you, that relying on the social network today, Facebook and Twitter, is not your long-term strategy. I really hope that today I can arm you with a better strategy that will help alleviate concerns and risks that your agency will otherwise face. And the reason why you can't rely on Facebook and Twitter is that, well, number one, they've made no guarantee to you. You have absolutely zero guarantee from Twitter and Facebook that your records will be there when you need them. And when anything is deleted from Twitter and Facebook, it's gone forever. Now, you might not delete anything, but your citizens certainly can. So a citizen might send you that crime tip over a direct message and delete it, or they might leave you a comment, a citizen complaint on a Facebook page, and then delete it. And you won't even know that happened. And Facebook actually makes it really clear that once something's deleted, you can't even get to it from a legal subpoena. So you don't want to rely on the networks. You want to have control over your own information. In fact, many states are now putting out guidance to agencies requiring them to take control of the information because of the fact that the social networks don't have any guarantees. And the best way to start is manual archiving. So again, kudos to the third of you on the line here today, that you're doing something, you've recognized the importance of these records. I will tell you that I feel your pain, because screenshotting can be time-consuming, but it is a good way to implement something without any cost. But you probably do want to look for a longer-term strategy. We have customers that were screenshotting, spending 20 to 30 hours a month. I know Sarah mentioned doing this once a month. Once a month is not ideal because of potential data loss in between. And so screenshotting is a really costly process in terms of your time. It's difficult to organize that information and search it if you had to find something. And ultimately, those records are not going to have the metadata. And in fact, anybody can Photoshop anything, so they may not be the best records to have in court. But they're absolutely, hands down, it's better to do screenshots, especially if you're moderating content, than just to do nothing at all. So please start, if nothing else. A better option is to look at something automated. There are many backup tools out there that are very inexpensive. These tools are generally tools designed for consumers to back up their own social media. So they're quite simple in terms of their data capture and usage, but that also makes them very cost-effective. Backupify, I think, is now $100 a month, and SocialSafe is another one that I think is about $20 a year, which is incredibly inexpensive. Although it is a tool that backs up on your local computer, which then causes you to have to figure out how you back up from your local computer to something else. But it's a very inexpensive way to automate, and if you have very little to no budget, this is a great way to start. What you have to recognize, though, for $20 a year, that's the kind of record keeping that you're going to get. This is not designed for government agencies. And a backup tool fundamentally isn't built for records management. That's why there's a difference between the word backup and the word archive. So being able to search and produce and make sense of your records is really difficult. Now, if you're serious about solving this problem, and I hope that all of you are, ultimately you will need an archiving solution. Now, there's a class of vendors out there, given this is an emerging issue, that come from email archiving and web archiving, and now they're including social media. Maybe they're including text messaging and other forms of content in one archive. So I like to call these all-in-one archiving. And I absolutely encourage you to evaluate these vendors to understand what they do and how they do it. But here's some key things to look out for. We all are familiar with the concept of a spork, right? It sounds great on paper. It's a spoon and a fork. But it may not be the best way to eat a salad, right? So think about, with an all-in-one archiving solution, what are they really good at? If they're really, really good at email archiving, what are they doing with your social media? Are they chopping that up into email? Are they losing the metadata? Can you reconstruct your conversations if a new comment comes in and it's in a separate email? Or are they doing something better than that? And these vendors continue to improve their solutions. If it's a web page archiving company, they're crawling and scraping. So how are they getting this content in a way that's not duplicating records over and over again? Are they ensuring they're getting new comments as they happen? Do you have the metadata again because they're scraping? So you really want to understand what the trade-offs are when it's all-in-one, because it can be really appealing to work with one vendor, but the reality is that some of these vendors may not be solving your problem, where other types of these vendors may be solving the problem, and you have to sort that out. Now, these vendors typically cost at least a few $1,000s a year and up, and sometimes there's setup fees for different things, like getting the history of your social media or just setting up your accounts. Ultimately, here are the 4 factors I encourage you to consider. Frequency, how quickly can you get this content? Because it's out of your control. You need to get it into your control in order to avoid potential data loss. You want to be as comprehensive as possible, especially because unlike email, unlike files, social media is broadcast in public, so it's likely that someone else could have a record, and so you want to make sure you have as comprehensive records as possible so that you can always tell your side of the story. Authenticity, because we're talking about legal situations here, can you actually take a Twitter tweet or a Facebook comment to court and prove the authenticity as a legal record? And then context, I think, is the most important and the most overlooked in the archiving industry. It's not about storing data. It's about being able to produce it and make sense of it. Can you reconstruct a Facebook conversation from 4 years ago with 100 comments on it? Can you replay that Twitter feed? How does this ultimately save you time and money, right? So context is incredibly important. Now, what we do at Archive Social is focus on social media archiving, and we focus on social media archiving specifically for government. We've had the great, fortune of working with some key some prominent government entities across the country. So I've noticed a few open archives here. These are governments that have taken transparency to its fullest. Not only are they storing their open records, but they're making their open records truly open. And so you can go explore these archives. One of my favorites is Snohomish County. This is a county that dealt with the mudslide emergency last year in the state of Washington. And their social media response was really great. They actually coined a hashtag 530slide, to track all of their emergency response. And so you can go to their open archives, search for that, and actually replay the emergency response. And they've received dozens of public records requests based on that emergency. And when it makes sense, they're able to direct citizens to the open archive of social media. And I'm going to go ahead and put my contact information on screen. I think I have 2 minutes here to give you that live demo I teased, so I'm going to do that. While I pull that up, if you have any questions, again, please put those questions in the Q&A box, because we're about to move into questions right after this demonstration. Great. So now I am showing my screen. I thought that the example that Sarah highlighted was really funny, so I put this into the archive, Accident in the Water Park. And if you search for it, you'll find that we actually did archive that post because it happened, I think, about 2 weeks before Helena started working with us. But we do pull the history of your social media, so we're able to pull that up in the archive. So this post will never be lost thanks to the archive. But what I want to focus on here are those 4 criteria. And I'm actually going to just stay on the search interface. We've got lots of functionality in our product. But I want to talk about those 4 criteria and ultimately being able to locate and make sense of your records. If you have a public information request, whatever solution you choose, you need to think about how you're going to narrow that search down to a specific time frame. How are you going to narrow it down to specific types of content? Say you have to look for content just on Twitter, or maybe you need to look across your entire social media presence. You need to be able to construct searches based on keywords and who was involved, so on and so forth. These are the kinds of things that you will find in almost any archiving solution. Now, what's really special, though, is if you look at what happens when you actually have to deal with the records. So what I just did there was I ran a wildcard search to give us the entire archive, 8,000 records coming back for the city of Helena, Montana. And that's a lot of information to deal with. So what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to drill down to find the content that you care about. So let's go look at the Helena, Montana Police Department page, for example. You want to have the context that I talked about. This looks and feels like Facebook with all the images and links and comments on it. You really want to be able to make sense of your records. That context is important. You want to be capturing this continuously throughout the day to get records as frequently as possible. And you want to have authenticity. So for example, if I click on this post right here, I know this is partially sticking off your screen, but behind this posting is a significant amount of metadata. So you want to be able to get to that metadata if at all possible, because we have a bit of legal precedent now in regards to electronic communications and needing metadata. You want to be able to use these records as legal evidence in court. And what I want to do is I just want to narrow this down to kind of close off this demonstration. Say you're actually fulfilling a public information request, and you have to narrow this down to police department content. Maybe you want to look at just comments on your photos. And let's say you want to go all the way back to June 2014. Well, we finally found the comment that we were looking for. Now what? Well, this is where context and having a robust archiving solution comes into place. You need to be able to reconstruct that conversation right then and there, to see the photo, to see all that content, to be able to replay that conversation. And ultimately, when you found what you've been looking for, you should be able to get that content out in just a minute or two so that you can move on with the rest of your responsibilities. So that's what archiving is about. It's about simplifying this issue, about saving you tremendous amounts of time so that the risk does not get in the way or impede your social media strategy in any way. And with that, I'm just going to transition this back to back to the slide deck, I suppose, with my contact info again, and then I'll hand it back to Morgan.
Hey, Anil, fantastic job. You guys see there's Anil's contact information. You guys grab that. Don't worry. Everybody's going to get a copy of this. You'll get a link to it, and we'll make sure that you get all of it. But, hey, look, you're right. We're coming up towards the end, so we wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time for Q&A because we do have a couple great questions. And actually, first one, Sarah, for you. Let's talk about the control issue. Let's talk about distinguishing your organization as the accurate resource. Give us a little insight what you meant by that.
Thank you. At the beginning of my presentation, I talked about the two fears that I needed to address, resources and control. In reality, the word control doesn't really apply anymore. And one of my favorite social media strategists, Brian Solis, has a quote that I'm going to paraphrase. He says, basically, if you don't at a minimum monitor your messages that are widely distributed, the issues, the stories, then those attitudes are theirs to define. If you're not defining and distinguishing yourself as the primary resource for information, then other people will be. So at a minimum, you need to be monitoring these social media sites and the activities on them so that you can address any inaccuracies. That's at a minimum. Of course, I always recommend that you are able to somehow respond to them. So control is sort of, I think there's not really control anymore.
You're absolutely right. But perception is reality. If people perceive somebody else as the authoritative source, then they'll treat them like that. And actually, for you out there, Jody, you had a question if Sarah's presentation will be available. Absolutely part of what we'll provide to you in 48 hours. But Anil, this one's for you. This is actually a very interesting one. It comes to us from Lucy Richards. Does saving a copy on your own server using Twitter or Facebook's own archiving functions meet the metadata criteria?
Lucy, that's a great question, and the answer is that is somewhat, but really no. And why I say that is that depending on the network, some of the networks do actually provide the metadata. So Twitter's archive feature, for what it gives you, does provide the original metadata just like we capture. So that's great. Facebook's does not. Here's the key point, though. Neither of those networks actually provide your archive. If you go download your Twitter archive today, first of all, it only contains what's still there. It doesn't contain anything that was deleted. So it's not actually an archive. That's a complete misnomer. It's actually just a snapshot. But even worse than that, Twitter and Facebook both leave out all of the third-party conversation. That means anything that you didn't post is not going to be in your archive. So you can get a download of your current public posts, which is better than nothing, but that leaves out a tremendous amount of information. Most of our customers are most concerned about what they've received from their citizens, and that's completely missing from Twitter and Facebook's archive. In fact, Twitter doesn't even provide you any of the private messaging. So those download archive features are very, very confusing and misleading. And so if you don't have anything in place at all and you get a request, you should definitely check them, but that's certainly not a strategy, and you should look at a more comprehensive archiving strategy.
Oh, hey, great. And Sarah, for you, I mean, you were talking a little bit, and Neil also talked about screenshottings. You were doing it once a year. Kind of walk us through a little bit about how much time that has freed up for you to actually focus on the things you were just talking about being able to monitor. So when you implemented an automated solution like Archive Social, kind of walk us through about the effect of freeing up that time and what it allowed you to do instead, and the confidence you had knowing that everything Anil just talked about and Lucy talked about was being captured.
Well, it's funny. When I first started into this idea that we needed to archive this because these are public records, the screenshots seemed okay to me, and I would save them as a PDF and put them in a records retention folder on our server. It didn't take me a whole lot of time because we weren't that active when I was doing it. It wasn't until I saw how active especially the police department page was, that I realized that the screenshots were going to end up taking me a lot more time. But the bigger concern about the screenshots was that while I could search for certain words within a PDF, unless I had them all in the same document, I was going to have to go into each month's document of screenshots and search for something related to a certain word. It was the search features that really made me uncomfortable. And I realized after watching some of what you were bringing up, I was reading a lot of those articles about the lawsuits and the legal issues, the legal implications of not archiving your social media and having it searchable. And that's when I really realized that those screenshots just weren't going to work, because the search features alone make it almost impossible to really deal with a variety of social media networks and platforms if you're going to use more than one. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. That's great. And Anil, this one's for you. Actually, Joyce Wittenberg gets the award because we always get this question. She raised it. So, Anil, what is the cost of something like this? She says ballpark, but I know you can do better than ballpark. I think you can actually give her some specific figures, can't you?
Oh, absolutely. And Joyce, thank you so much for asking this question. Sometimes I get so excited about our product, I forget to talk about how much it costs, and that's actually one of our greatest selling points, because it looks like an expensive product, but 90% of our customers fall under what we call our standard plan, which is under $5,000 a year, which means that this is a discretionary spend for most agencies out there. In fact, we actually have a pricing plan well under $5,000 a year. We have no other hidden fees, unlike other, as you may be familiar with other types of vendors. Absolutely no other fees. It's a fixed cost, and the way we price is based on the level of your social media activity. So if you're doing a lot on social media, then your cost will be higher because our value is higher. But even if you have 10 Facebook pages, but you're not doing anything, then your cost will be pretty low with us. So it's very, very inexpensive, and it's something that, again, that we've intentionally priced the way we did to make a discretionary spend so that you're able to be proactive and get it in place.
Well, and obviously, having been in state and local government before, and as you mentioned too, that discretionary spend, being able to put it into the budget process and keep it there. Once you get started with this, it's hard to pull it out. So, again, back to you, Joyce. Great question. We always get that question. I'm glad you raised it up. Hey, Anil, for you real quick, and then we'll finish up with one last question for Sarah here. Lucy Richards again asked a question about what other states, and I know you guys you've got the National Archives, you've got North Carolina. Are there any other states, or what are some other big customers that Archive Social is dealing with?
Sure, happy to answer that. And one more add-on to the last question is that because we sell a transparency product, we are extremely transparent. Our pricing and all of our terms and everything is completely transparent on our website, so I encourage folks to check that out. Now, in terms of our customer base, we've been incredibly fortunate. We're able to work with some of the largest agencies in the country, down to individual police departments, fire departments, and towns. State of North Carolina was one of our very early customers. We also do work with the South Carolina state libraries and state agencies in many other states, including Florida, Washington, and Texas. In general, we have hundreds of government agencies across more than 30 different states in the United States. Probably one of my proudest moments is that the U.S. National Archives, which is the federal agency that creates all of this strategy at the federal level for record keeping, which then trickles down to the states. They've been the most vocal about social media as a record since 2009, and for their own social media, they selected Archive Social. So we've been really fortunate. In other major cities like San Francisco, Austin, Orlando, Louisville, Charlotte, so on and so forth. So it's been really great for us to work with a variety of agencies.
Yes, and guys, we're closing in on our time. Sir, I just want to give you the last 15 seconds. Just close out your final piece of advice, best piece of advice you could give everybody who's involved in social media.
Okay, that's an easy one. When you are looking at different opportunities, different companies to go with, look at when Anil talked about context, he was really right on, because when we considered going with the organization that does our email archiving, they really did not specialize in social media. They specialized in overall records retention. So they were going to go through the person's account as opposed to the page in terms of archiving. So that little picture of me at a fundraiser would have ended up in our archiving for the city of Helena local government. So really look, when you're writing your list of specs for the different demos that you set up, really pay attention to the context and what they're exactly archiving.
Well, hey, great, guys. Look, we want to be respectful of our time, but first of all, thank you to Sarah, and thank you to Anil for being on the call. It's great, great information, folks. Remember, this will be available. We want to also thank our sponsor for this, which is Anil and Archive Social, for allowing us to bring this discussion to everybody out in the audience. And, folks, we want to thank you again for attending this webinar. Make sure you join us. Make sure you look for the future events, and we'll be coming to a screen near you over the Internet. So for everybody who's joined us today, thank you. Share this with your colleagues. And everybody, have a great day, and thank you from Government Technology.